I remember standing at the front of that little chapel, watching the room fill with people who loved him, neighbors, old customers, and a man he'd taught to build a porch in 1994. Everyone showed up, except the two people who shared his blood and my last name. And then, right there in the pew, my phone buzzed. I looked down, and the ground tilted beneath me. But to understand that buzz, you have to understand the man in the casket at the front of the room. My parents left when I was 7. Roy and Denise Anderson had places to be, apparently, and a little girl was a weight they set down like an old coat. So, Walter took me in. He was 51 then, a retired carpenter with sawdust in the creases of his hands, and he didn't sigh once. He just made up the spare room and bought me a nightlight shaped like the moon. He came to every single thing. When I was 9, I asked him why my parents didn't want me. He set down his coffee and said something I've carried my whole life. Showing up is the whole thing, sweetheart, he told me. The rest is just noise. Love isn't a speech, it's a person in a chair. And for 27 years, he was the person in the chair. He walked me down the aisle when I married Sam. He held my daughter, Nora, an hour after she was born and cried without shame. So no, I was never confused about who my family was. Which is why, during that last, hard week of his life, when he needed me the most, the thing that still keeps me up at night is that I got there late. The cancer came for his pancreas, which is the kind that doesn't negotiate. By spring, the chemo had completely hollowed him out. I drove the 20 minutes to his house every evening after I closed my books. I keep the ledgers for half the small businesses in town, so numbers are my entire trade. I'd make him toast he couldn't finish, and we'd sit and watch the same old westerns. That was when my mother reappeared. Denise, who lived in Florida and only ever surfaced when something could be spent, suddenly flew up to help Daddy. She took over his mail. She took over his bank. When I offered to sit down and organize his accounts, my actual profession, she smiled that tight smile and said, "Daddy wants his privacy, Colleen." I pushed back. I asked to be added so I could watch for fraud, the way any accountant would. She told me he'd set it up his way and that it wasn't my place. And here is the part one keep turning over in my head. I was suspicious. I asked the right questions. I even called his bank, but they told me only the account holder or his power of attorney could discuss it. And his power of attorney was Denise. There was a wall around him. It had my mother's signature on it, and there was nothing I could legally reach across. I told myself she was his daughter. I told myself grief was making me paranoid. I brought him soup, I kept my mouth shut, and I trusted the wrong thing. 3 weeks later, he was gone. And I still didn't know what she was hiding behind that tight little smile. He died on a Tuesday at home, with me holding his hand and a nurse named Grace on the other side. Denise had flown back to Florida 4 days earlier because, and I am quoting here, she couldn't just sit around waiting. So, I planned the funeral alone. I picked the hymns. I wrote the obituary at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning while Sam slept. I called the church, the florist, and the man who digs the graves. And then I called my mother to tell her the date. There was a pause, with pool noises echoing in the background, before she said they couldn't make it back in time. Flights were expensive. Daddy would understand. They'd say a prayer down there. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long time after she hung up. I thought about Walter in his child-sized chair at every recital. I thought about the receipts he took notes on. Showing up is the whole thing, sweetheart. He'd said it so many times, it lived in me like a heartbeat. And his own daughter couldn't find a flight. Something inside me just went quiet. It's the way you feel when a number won't reconcile, no matter how many times you run it. I told myself 2 empty chairs at a funeral was the absolute worst thing they could do to me. I told myself it couldn't get any lower than a daughter skipping her father's grave. I was wrong about that. I was so wrong. The lowest thing was still 3 hours away, and it was already loaded and waiting on a beach in the Caribbean. The funeral was on a gray Saturday, the kind of morning where the sky can't decide if it wants to rain. I got there early and I saved 2 chairs in the front row. I don't know why. Hope is a stubborn animal. I set a folded program on each seat, and I waited for a daughter who wasn't coming. The chapel filled up behind me. I turned around once, and my breath caught because the room was packed. There was the Delgado family, whose fence he rebuilt for free after the flood. There was old Mr. Apprentice, crying into a handkerchief the size of a dish towel. There was a woman I didn't recognize, who told me Walter had taught her late husband his whole trade and that they'd never forgotten it. Half the town came for a retired carpenter, yet 2 chairs in the front row stayed empty, with 2 little programs sitting on them like place cards for ghosts. The pastor spoke. Grace, the nurse, squeezed my shoulder. I stood up to read the words I'd written at 2 in the morning, and my voice held strong. Because Walter's granddaughter does not fall apart in public. He raised me steadier than that. I sat back down. I looked at those 2 empty chairs one more time, and that was the exact moment my phone buzzed in my black coat pocket. I almost didn't look, but I did. It was a photo. My mother, in a turquoise sarong, holding a drink with a little umbrella in it. My father grinning behind her, sunburned and pleased. White sand and a blue ocean that only exists in vacation brochures. And underneath, typed in her own cheerful hand, were 4 words that I will hear for the rest of my life. Living our best life. Posted publicly. Timestamped 11 minutes into her father's funeral. My hand went ice cold around the phone. I was still holding the phone when it buzzed again in my hand. A text this time, from a contact saved in my phone under just 1 word, Grandpa. His number. The number I'd called every night for months. The number that had gone quiet on Tuesday, when a nurse named Grace pulled a sheet up and I stopped breathing for a while. And now it lit up my screen like nothing had happened. Sweetheart, come to my house right now. I read it 4 times. My grandfather was in the ground behind me. I had watched him die. There was no version of the world where that phone should be sending me anything. My skin broke out in gooseflesh under my black wool coat. I looked back toward the cemetery, then down at his name glowing on my screen. And I did the only thing his granddaughter could do. I turned the key. Walter's house sat 20 minutes out of town, on a road that turns to gravel right at the mailbox. I made it in 15. The whole drive, my hands wouldn't quite stop shaking. I kept the radio off, telling myself all the reasonable things. It was a wrong number, a glitch, or someone's cruel idea of a joke. But the porch light was on when I pulled up. The front door stood wide open, and there was a car in the driveway that I half recognized. I walked up the steps I had painted with him the summer I turned 12. Inside, sitting at his kitchen table, was a heavy-set man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, holding Walter's phone in his hand. It was Harold Metz, Walter's lawyer for 30 years, and, I think, his last real friend. It was an old cigar box, the kind he used to keep screws in, and it had my name written on the lid in his shaky block letters. Inside were 3 things. A journal with a soft blue cover, worn at the corners. A thick stack of bank statements, photocopied and paper-clipped by month. And a folder holding a copy of a legal document I recognized before I could even read the title, because I filed 100 of them, a durable power of attorney, with Denise's name on the signature line. I looked up at Harold. He folded his hands. Your grandfather didn't trust his daughter, he said quietly. Not at the end. He wanted you to have the truth, Colleen. Not just the grief. He said you were the only one who'd know what to do with numbers. And the only one who ever showed up. I ran my thumb over the blue cover of the journal. I could feel the ridges where a shaking hand had pressed too hard. I didn't open it yet. I wasn't ready. But holding that box, I understood that my life had just split into a before and an after, and there was no gluing it back together. If you've ever been handed grief and paperwork in the exact same breath, you know just how loud a quiet kitchen can get. Stay with me, because this is the moment I stopped being the girl who just kept the peace. Comment showing up down below if there is someone in your life who always did. And make sure to subscribe, because what I found in those pages is the exact reason my mother is where she is today. Then I opened the journal. Walter's handwriting had always been square and sure, a true carpenter's hand. But these pages started strong and progressively got worse. Line by line, the letters loosened as the chemo stole his grip. The early entries were just a sick man's diary. Bad night. Grace changed the dressing. Colleen brought soup. Stayed for the Western. But then, a few weeks in, the tone shifted. Money's tight again, he wrote. And I don't know why. Denise says I spent it. Maybe I did. I get so tired. I can't remember. I read that line 3 times. My grandfather never lost track of a single nickel in his life. He kept receipts in a shoebox sorted by decade. Yet here he was, in his own failing hand, wondering aloud where his savings had gone, while his daughter told him he'd simply spent it. Sam read over my shoulder and went very still. The kettle screamed, and neither of us moved. Somewhere in these pages, I already knew, was the shape of the very thing that had built a wall around a dying man. I turned to the next entry. My hands were steadier now. Numbers are the one place I never lose my nerve, and Walter, God bless him, had started keeping his own. The middle of the journal was where a scared old man turned into a careful one. After that first round of chemo, Walter wrote that Denise had sat him down and told him his mind wasn't safe anymore. She told him he needed help managing things and that she would take the burden off him. So, he signed the durable power of attorney right there at his own kitchen table, the day after a treatment that had left him too weak to even lift a spoon. She had brought the papers completely pre-filled. He signed because